First to the charges laid today against 4 men over the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 nearly 5 years ago. 3 of these men are Russian, 1 Ukrainian. All are directly linked to Moscow. Now, this is no surprise, given the day after this atrocity, American intelligence indicated it was a Russian Buk missile system specifically moved into eastern Ukraine that was used to shoot down this commercial airliner. Now, the 4 suspects aren't accused of actually pulling the trigger, but they have been charged with murder, which is significant. Whether they'll ever actually face justice is unclear. In a moment, I'll be speaking to the former Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, who played a key role in fighting for access to the crash site for investigators all those years ago, and of course for fighting for justice for the families of the 38 Australians who died. First, Danica DiGiorgio takes a look at the charges laid and how prosecutors got to this point.
It's nearly 5 years since Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. 38 of the 298 people killed were Australian, including Perth siblings Otis, Evie and Mo Maslin, and their grandfather, Nick Norris. Now, for the first time, those accused of being behind the attack have been named. Russians Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, Oleg Pulatov and Ukrainian Leonid Kachenko are facing murder charges.
Today we will send out international arrest warrants for the first suspects that we will prosecute. They will also be placed on national and international wanted lists.
A joint investigation team led by the Dutch and including Australia has spent years gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. The men are accused of bringing the deadly weapon, a Buk M1 missile, into the field in eastern Ukraine. The suspects include high-ranking Russian military figures. A date for criminal proceedings has been set in The Hague, March 9, 2020, but under Russian and Ukrainian law, the suspects cannot be extradited. Prosecutors have issued this appeal to the men.
We expressly appeal for the suspects to note down the time and date and to report in to be present during their criminal trial.
Foreign Minister Maurice Payne has released a statement saying this is a significant step in the Dutch prosecution towards justice and accountability for the victims of the downing and their loved ones. Danica DiGiorgio, Sky News.
Well, it's the former Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, as mentioned, who fought very hard at the time for access for investigators to get into that site and, of course, for justice for all those families. She joins me now. Julie Bishop, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. It has taken a long time to get to this point. What does it mean to you to see these charges finally laid?
It is an immense relief. I welcome the fact that individuals have now been named for potential prosecution. It has been a very long, complex and thorough investigation. It commenced with Australia and the Netherlands obtaining that unanimous UN Security Council resolution back in July of 2014, which enabled us to set up the joint investigation team. The Australian Federal Police investigators have been working with counterparts from Ukraine, Malaysia, Netherlands and Belgium, and they have gathered an enormous amount of evidence. The investigation first found that it was a Buk missile that brought down MH17, killing all 298 aboard. Then they found, significantly, that the Buk missile belonged to the Russian army, the 53rd Brigade, and that it had been taken from Russia into eastern Ukraine, used to bring down MH17 and then taken back into Russia. And now, even more significantly, they have named 4 individuals as suspects. And as you indicated in the opening, they all have links to the Russian military. So this is significant progress, but there is more work to be done, and the investigation must be allowed to continue because there were many people clearly involved in the decision to send this heavy artillery, this military weapon, into Ukraine.
I mean, was it ever in any doubt for you that this was directly linked to Russia? Russia put out all sorts of conspiracy theories as to who else might have shot down this commercial airliner, but was that really ever in doubt in your mind?
From the outset, we had access to intelligence that made it very clear that this was a surface-to-air missile. None of these theories about it being shot down by another plane or any of those theories held any water. that it was a surface-to-air missile and that it came from Russia into eastern Ukraine. That was our view, and that was the information we had, very reliable intelligence at the time. And 5 years later, the Joint Investigation Team have concluded precisely that. Russia has not produced any evidence or information that contradicts any of the findings of the Joint Investigation Team. And Russia was a party to that UN Security Council resolution. Indeed, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it has a particular responsibility to uphold the resolutions of the Council. And that Resolution 2166 requires all states to cooperate with the investigation and produce all relevant information. Russia has not done so today.
But it hasn't. It hasn't cooperated. It hasn't provided that information. It's frustrated this process, and today is denying all this still and saying it won't be allowing its citizens to be extradited. So what happens? What happens from here?
There are a number of things that can happen, and I know the Australian government will pursue every legal avenue, as will the Dutch government. Of course, the Netherlands lost about 190 of their citizens on board this flight. We lost 38. But there are a number of processes underway. Last year, in May last year, when the Joint Investigation Team released those significant findings that the Buk missile belonged to the Russian Army, the 53rd Brigade, we issued a notice to Russia, the Russian government, holding it responsible under international law, that is, state responsibility under international law for breaches of its obligations under international law. And this process requires Russia to negotiate. And there is some cause for optimism, because recently the Russian officials met with Australian and Dutch officials to commence dialogue on how such negotiations into the circumstances of the shooting down of MH17 could be conducted. So Russia is a member of the international community. Russia is on the Security Council. Russia has an obligation to be as constructive as they can be. And yes, they have run a disinformation campaign from the outset. However, the fact that they're prepared to talk to our officials gives me some hope.
Well, I mean, does it? You've sat across the table from these guys, you know, when it used to be your Russian counterpart. I think from memory you even spoke to Vladimir Putin directly about this at one point as well. Yet we see these, I mean, you say disinformation, some might say lies from Russia about this, about meddling in the US presidential election, about the Novichok nerve agent attack on British soil. Time and again, Russia just seems to get away with it.
Russia is a disruptor. In fact, it prides itself on being a disruptor in international affairs. Australia has taken a stand on this and other issues involving Russia. Its invasion of Ukraine in the first place, which of course Russia denies. Yet if the MH17 trial proves that Russia was backing the separatists with military weapons, then that gives a lie to its complete denial that it's got anything to do with the civil war in Ukraine. And then, of course, we took issue with its annexation of Crimea. And so we have had differences with Russia over a long period of time with its interpretation of the rules-based order. And Australia
what does that amount to? Because I mean, it's still, Russia still sits as a permanent member, as you say, of the UN Security Council. I mean, is Australia comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with that?
There are sanctions regimes that are imposed and are continuing to be imposed. This will have an impact on Russia's economy. And recently, the Australian government imposed more sanctions involving the allegations of poisoning and the Novichok allegations. And so there are a series of sanctions against Russia. But the international community has to come together and urge Russia to cooperate in the MH17 investigation, as well as abide by the international rules-based order. This is not something Australia can do alone, and we've been working very closely with the Dutch, the Malaysians, the Belgians, the Ukrainians. But there are many grieving nations who lost citizens aboard MH17, about 15 or so nations. They and others must join together and call on Russia to abide by its international obligations. Meanwhile, we'll continue to pursue this other but complementary process of holding Russia to account under international law, state responsibility, whereas the Dutch national prosecution will be pursuing individuals.
Let me ask you finally, Julie Bishop, I mean, you're no longer in politics, but we can hear how deeply committed you are still to this. I mean, are you still in touch with some of those families that were directly affected by this? And, you know, what do you say to them about the chances of seeing justice actually delivered?
We promised at the time, 5 years ago, that we would continue to pursue justice, to find answers for the next of kin who deserve to know how and why their loved ones were killed aboard this commercial plane. It has international implications. I mean, you can't have commercial flights being shot down by military force over a war zone. That just cannot happen again. And yes, I am in contact, particularly with the Maslins, who were constituents of mine, and Rin and Maz are extraordinary people who have managed through the most devastating circumstances, the loss of their 3 children and their children's grandfather, to get on with their life. But we owe it to them, and we owe it to all the Australians, all those on board, to continue to find answers and to hold those who are responsible for this despicable crime, hold them to justice.
Indeed, indeed. And Julie Bishop, we thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate that.